Hello, everyone. My name is Crispin, and welcome to the final podcast ahead of the 2020 US election. This will be uploaded just before the polls open in the United States. Many of you won't even listen to this until the results are largely in. So this prediction podcast could have a very short life indeed. Nevertheless, as a political forecaster, I do think it is important to stake one's credibility from time to time when it comes to these predictions. Nevertheless, this year is harder to predict than anything in my entire career. There are so many unknowns. For instance, the pandemic, obviously, unprecedented period of an election year, not only in terms of the verdict of Trump's re-election prospects, but the impact that will have on turnout, the impact that's already had on early voting, on postal voting. It's just really unreal. The early voting, 100 million people voted earlier in the United States, and that really messes with my models for multiple reasons. Number one, these are votes in a tank. I'm no longer factoring in that everybody is voting with a certain percentage degree of probability, because not everyone, even those who intend to vote, will actually end up voting on election day. They'll get a flat tire. They could get children who are unwell. They could find themselves in a line and not be able to remain. There's all kinds of things that could prevent someone from voting on election day, even if they are a committed voter for one side or the other. But if you have the postal votes and early votes already in, well, those are things that are in the tank, and that really messes with the modeling. And to that end, the early voting certainly favors Democrats. It's the Democrats who will be voting early. It's the Democrats who will be voting via postal voting. And so we would expect that going into the final day, they would have a healthy voting lead. But will that remain the case by the end of the day? And my answer is probably no. Probably no. Indeed, if on the balance of probabilities, my prediction is that Donald J. Trump will be re-elected President of the United States over Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. And the reason for that is that the paths to victory for Donald Trump, the paths that had looked incredibly narrow even a few weeks ago, have opened up a bit. So if you recall, in 2016, Trump won the Midwest, areas in the United States that had traditionally voted sort of working class Democrat. Well, instead they voted for Donald Trump as a working class kind of hero, an outsider coming in against the establishment, bundling both Democrat and Republican elites together into one sort of gelatinous blob or swamp, if you like. And he won them over, promising to bring back jobs from overseas, renegotiate trade deals, increase tariffs, lower taxes and lower regulations to increase manufacturing domestically in the United States. And that was music to the ears of people in Wisconsin, in Michigan, in Ohio, in Pennsylvania, the states that had not really gone Republican in a very, very long time, and yet he managed to flip all of those states to become president of the United States. So unsurprisingly, those places remain key. What are the things that are in Biden's camp? Well, first of all, as I mentioned, the early voting, certainly very strong turnout, promising for the Democrats. Also, Trump does have a women problem. In 2016, he won the vote with white women. So Hillary was basically completely abandoned by people who looked very much like her. The only white women that were strongly in her camp were people that were earning over $200,000 US. So most white women were thinking about security. They were thinking about working class values, suburban living, and that sort of thing. So they voted for Donald Trump, who was very much the law and order candidate. So he retains that sense of attraction. Nevertheless, there are people who've been turned off Trump. He seems to be a bit heartless. He seems to be a bit ridiculous when it comes to the pandemic. He has said constant things on Twitter. I think people gave him the benefit of the doubt when he said that he would sort of become presidential in the office. He certainly hasn't done that. Nevertheless, he has done things that a lot of conservatives had feared he wouldn't do or would fail to do, and that included, nominating sort of originalists to the Supreme Court and other federal courts and jurisdictions. He certainly lived up to those promises. He is a very sort of pro-life candidate, so the evangelicals have supported him and will turn out strongly for him today. And also, he has done a lot to bring back jobs to the United States. Now, of course, the economy has been smashed by the disease, and the degree to which the Democrats could capitalize on that is really proportionate to how much people think that Trump could avoid the current situation. But not only that, and this is something that's quite important for Trump's victory, is that people are starting in the United States to think about the time beyond the pandemic. What you have from Joe Biden and Kamala Harris is sort of promises of more lockdowns, more restrictions, more kind of epidemiologists sort of run government programs, whereas Donald Trump is saying, look, we have to get back the economy. We have to get things open and moving again. We have to get back to our lives. We have good therapeutics. We have a vaccine coming. I myself, the president of the United States, is a 70-something-year-old man, overweight, got the disease and lived through it quite fine. So, we need to move on and get back to our lives and stop thinking about this disease. Now, that is a really interesting, contrasting message, and it really does appeal to the sort of individualist, self-guided, non-government intervention mentality that many Americans have, even if such a view is not as popular in other parts of the world. So that's a very, important consideration. He's got a lot of energy. He's back to his best when it comes to the rallies he's been running. I mean, in Florida, they had 57,000 people turn out to a rally. He ran rallies right up to the last second of the last day in Michigan, in Grand Rapids. I think it finished at like 1 a.m. on election morning. So he has been campaigning like a beast. And I think people have really appreciated that. And people have turned out to sort of defy the mainstream media and defy the pundits and defy the polls. And that gives people a sense that, yes, it is worth coming out and voting for Donald Trump. So that I think is people underestimate the impact of those rallies, particularly in contrast to Joe Biden. And one of the messages that are perfectly clear is that there isn't a single person alive that is voting for Joe Biden, except for those in his own family and stand to benefit. The people are voting against Donald Trump. That's the only reason why Democrats are voting, is to get Donald Trump out of office. They couldn't care less about Joe Biden. I think a lot of people expect Kamala Harris to take over the reins pretty early on. She did abysmally herself in the primary, so she has no real basis to support, even though many sort of mainstream outlets, media outlets, New York Times, etc., will go out and shill for her. There is a cloud hanging over the Biden family. I think that despite the enormous suppression from tech giants and the absolute dereliction of duty of many large media circulations, despite that, I think it is clear that the Hunter Biden laptop has put a cloud over Joe Biden. A lot of his appeal, such as it was, relies heavily on his kind of honest integrity, bringing things back to the normal. But two things kind of, weaken that a bit, or three things. First of all is his cognitive decline. People realize that he just doesn't have the vigor to implement positive change that they would hope that, a president would have. Secondly, he does have a sort of peevish attitude to things. He gets angry really easily. He is happy to resort to calling people names. So the whole we have to move on beyond this politics of toxicity. Well, it's not clear that Joe Biden will be the man to do that. And then thirdly, now there's sense of Biden Inc., Biden corruption with China, Biden corruption with Ukraine, with Russia. I think that some of that mud has actually stuck. Now, does that mean that people are going to switch their votes from Democrat to Republican? No, I think most people had made up their minds before that, but it could easily stop people coming out to vote. The weather is cold, the lines will be long, people who have ordered mail-in ballots have to return those ballots, have to, go and drop them in the box somewhere. It is not clear that that's what they're going going to do. So I am confident, very confident, that today we'll see an enormous turnout of primarily Republican voters. They are the ones that will wait to election day and turn out in person in the polls, in part because that's what Donald Trump has been urging, but also there's a sort of conservative appeal to that. Coming out, taking time off on the Tuesday to go and vote is a sort of conservative Republican thing. So today's showing will be strongly Republican. It's just a matter of whether or not that is strong enough to overcome the pro-Democrat votes that are already in the tank from the early voting and postal voting, and that's not 100% clear. Why am I increasingly confident that Donald Trump will be reelected? Although, again, most unpredictable election ever. But I think Donald Trump has done enough in the sense that Pennsylvania is now a genuine toss-up. A few weeks ago, Pennsylvania was, potentially, likely slipping to Biden. And that made Donald Trump's path to re-election really narrow. He had to win essentially everything else: Florida, Arizona, Ohio, Wisconsin, Michigan, and so on. Now the Pennsylvania, if that goes to Trump, then the chances of him winning the whole thing is extremely high. I do think that he is going to retain Florida. Donald Trump has made inroads and solidified the Hispanic vote. There's a lot of people in Florida who do not like socialism. A lot of Cuban Hispanics who think of the Castro regime with a high degree of antipathy. And to that end, Kamala Harris in particular has done the Joe Biden Kamala Harris ticket no favors by releasing videos essentially praising communism with equality of outcome. The Cuban Hispanics of Florida have seen this story before. So I think Donald Trump, both, having registered Florida as his home state, having done many rallies there, having spoken directly to the hope and aspirations of people who live in Florida, I think that he will retain that with a reasonable margin, even though the polls are much, much tighter, if not pro-Biden. I don't think that Trump will lose Florida. Arizona, interesting toss-up, but I think that he will retain Arizona. He will probably lose one of Michigan or Wisconsin. I don't think that he'll lose both, and I think it would be a stretch for him to win both. I think that would be a real achievement, possible, but probably a little bit too difficult. And then Pennsylvania, it really comes down to that, doesn't it? I think he'll win Ohio, but Pennsylvania is the big toss-up, and he has done more than any other candidate in my living memory to really try and steal that back from the Democrats. Philadelphia will lean strongly Democratic. There has been, I think, like 2 million postal votes already in Pennsylvania. 3/4 of those would be Democrat registered participants. But this is another sign that since the election has been started, the Republicans have, for new voters, registered new Republican voters in these battleground states at a rate like 2, 3 to 1, in part because the Democrat strategy has been, encouraging lockdowns, encouraging safety. They think that message will have more resonance. Nevertheless, the on-the-ground operation from Republicans has managed to identify a bunch of people who have not voted before, who haven't registered for a party, and they've been out and taken to register as Republican. That is certainly true for working class, non-university educated males in particular, for which Trump has an enormous lead. That is his absolute backbone base. And the Republican machine has been superb at identifying those people and making sure they have the opportunity to vote, whereas the kind of Democrat way of reaching their voters has been lackluster at best. They really rely on people's anger about Donald Trump, the fear for the Republic, and the visceral Trump derangement syndrome to drive them to the polls. But I think there's only so much that can do. Beyond that, I think Donald Trump has made some important inroads into sort of bases that you wouldn't otherwise expect. In particular, you would have the young black men. So again, Donald Trump has men generally who who are, aren't university educated, aren't coastal elites, aren't in the Washington establishment, aren't in the Beltway, aren't part of Hollywood, well, they have a certain appeal towards Trump in general, and of course, Black Americans are no exception necessarily to that. But in particular, Donald Trump has won the endorsement of several influential sort of Black musicians. He has spoken very strongly to the fact that Democrats seem to, assume the vote. You had Joe Biden coming out and saying, look, if you don't vote for me, you're not Black. You've got all that sort of, why should Democrats just assume that if you're Black, you'll vote Democrat, and take advantage of the fact that they can assume that vote and not, give enough in return, whereas Donald Trump actually seems to be courting these people. So I think that has a certain appeal, particularly to rebellious young youth who want to sort of turn the backs on that sort of establishment types. Then there's also the gay Americans. Donald Trump has been easily the most popular Republican candidate among the LGBTQ community, and in part because Richard Grenell is the first ever cabinet-appointed member by a president to be openly gay, and that's, of course, Donald Trump's sort of former national security advisor, who has continued to campaign very strongly for Donald Trump, starting Pride for Trump and all the rest of it. So I think, 1 in 3, 1 in 4 gay Americans will vote for the Republicans, which is a huge jump from what had been a uniform voting bloc not a very long time ago. So for all of these reasons, I think that Donald Trump has made certain inroads into the typical Democrat heartland. I think he's firming up the working class vote among himself. He's created a huge amount of enthusiasm with his campaigning in the last few days. I think he's gone to like 14 different, sort of rallies in the last 3 days, something insane. And I think the Republicans will repay that. And then he also has a strong message that, prior to the pandemic, there was the strongest economy in many decades, the lowest African-American unemployment, the lowest female unemployment, the lowest Hispanic unemployment for many years. Working class wages have been growing again. And he's also managed to paint Joe Biden quite badly, someone who had been there for 47 years, who had been part of all the major trade deals, who had been invested in endless foreign wars, all the things that the American kind of working class despise, and he has been tied to that pretty strongly. So I think Donald Trump has pulled off a bit of a massive trick out of the hat here, which is to, despite the fact being president for the past 4 years and being against, the enormity of the mainstream media, the intelligence community, the Democrats, the coastal elite, the Hollywood establishment, all of that, he has managed to paint himself again as the outsider for a second time. And that's a really difficult thing for an incumbent president to do. He's managed to paint Joe Biden as the incumbent and Donald Trump as the insurgent. That's going to play really well for him. Do I think this is going to be a breakout landslide Donald Trump victory? No, I think the forces against him are immense, that people have been, persuaded on all kinds of things not to vote for Donald Trump. But nevertheless, I do think that just where the American people are, the zeitgeist, Donald Trump's general message of future hope and prosperity, not just sort of lockdown and continued malaise, the pushback against things like critical race theory and fears about Antifa and left-wing mobs and rioting and looting, and Donald Trump standing up for the police and for law and order and for border control. I think all of these things are going to play very well. Tax cuts, the terrible blunder that Joe Biden made with the anti-fracking messaging, the transitioning out of fossil fuels. These are things that are going to be, sink like a lead balloon in places like Ohio. So Donald Trump has been getting the momentum going into this final day, and I think this final day will see a significant turnout, and ultimately, with very close margins, a Donald Trump victory. Even though I think the Electoral College vote will probably push to about 290 for him, that's not a thumping victory. And there'll be a significant delay in the count. I don't think it'll be all declared by the time this goes up. We'll be attending Charlene and I will be attempting a sort of count party tomorrow afternoon, our time. So the count will be sort of well and truly underway, I don't anticipate a path to victory to be absolutely clear for either candidate by the time we start that sort of stream up. So do stay tuned for that. But otherwise, my final prediction is that Donald Trump will be re-elected president of the United States, despite the polls, despite the pundits, and despite the mainstream media. That's my view. Maybe this will be a very short-lived prediction indeed. Perhaps this will damage my otherwise astonishingly, I think, successful and established credibility immensely, because this is a big call. But nevertheless, I think that all the signs point to Trump. So that's my view. Happy to hear your thoughts and make fun of me if I'm wrong. And I will see you in the next podcast. Thank you very much. Goodbye.